Hello everyone. I thank Comcare for the opportunity to talk to you, but also thank all of you for the opportunity to listen to CSIRO's story. It's the story that is continuing, and there is still a bit of nervousness about talking publicly about CSIRO's story. And I will say, I was talking to one of my senior managers yesterday about starting with this particular slide, positive impact. And he was a bit nervous and he said, "Oh, I don't know if you should do that. How do you think people will receive that?" And I said, well, this slide normally in a CSIRO presentation is actually used to talk about the positive impact that our science and our research has on all of you. Every day at this conference, your ability to use Wi-Fi, that's a CSIRO invention. CSIRO's science and research for nearly 90 years in Australia has impacted people in a positive way, I think every day. But in the last probably 2 to 3 years, a lot of the positive stuff we have around our science and research has been overtaken by a lot of negative publicity and interest in our organisation when it comes to the topic of bullying and harassment. And for many of you who work in the space of workers' compensation and return to work and rehab, and in my space, industrial relations, where you're dealing with a lot of reactive and quite hard-going work. You're dealing with broken down employment relationships, quite aggrieved people, you do struggle sometimes to find the positive that you do day to day. And it's hard to look at this and go, am I really making a positive impact in people's lives? And when it came to bullying and harassment in CSIRO, there were days where we would say, you know, when are we going to get through this? When are we going to see something positive? And I think through a lot of challenging times, we are starting to see the positive now. And I'm not standing up here today to say that we've solved it and bullying and harassment will no longer occur in a CSIRO workplace. It's just not, it's not the case, and it's not realistic to say that. But I think what I'd like to do is share with you some things that you can do day to day, I hope, with some of the tools that we developed. And we had a lot of support from Comcare to do that. And that's what I'd like to share with you. I will set the scene with a fair bit of context though, because I think the context helps to tell the story about where we've been. Some of these things you probably are very well aware of. The Brodie's laws in Victoria that were taken by the Victorian government in response to the case of Brodie Panlock, a young cafe worker who was a subject to terrible bullying and harassment in the workplace and who took her own life. You've had changes to legislation. At the federal level, I'll talk a little bit about the parliamentary inquiry into workplace bullying, but I will focus on the Comcare Improvement Notice and the recent CSIRO investigation into bullying and harassment. They're the context piece that I think help to set the changes that we've made. So just a little bit on CSIRO, our vision. I've talked about our science and our research. We do hope to make a profound and positive impact for the future of all of you. And we do try to deliver innovative solutions for industry and society. This is CSIRO today. We have been through quite a significant restructure in the past 6 to 12 months. Many in the public sector have seen budget cuts and changes in their own organisations, and that is bringing in itself psychosocial risk, and something that we are using now in our workplace is psychosocial risk assessments of those particular work teams, and even looking at individual factors as well. But our organisation has shrunk. When I did a presentation on CSIRO probably about 6 months ago, we had about 6,500 staff, but we're pretty big. And we also have a very unique workforce. People don't like to say, "Oh, you're so special. You think you're all intelligent. You're all very analytical." But we do have quite a unique workforce, and we have to work with that, and a unique culture as well, which we need to acknowledge. It's 90 years of culture in our organisation. We have moved into a new operating model to reduce some of the complexity for people. I know that's a very busy slide, but in essence, we've moved into a business line mode of operating. We did have staff that used to sit in divisions that would then, their capability was then moved into flagships to work on big national challenges, and we have changed that recently. So our flagships are around these key areas: agriculture, biosecurity, digital productivity, energy, manufacturing, land and water, food, nutrition, minerals, oceans and atmosphere. So the big challenges facing Australia and facing the globe really. So here's just a few of the inventions, and that's what we want to be known for. But when I start to tell you the story of the last 2 to 3 years, a lot of the headlines and a lot of the interest from many of our stakeholders were not on our science. They were on what's going on in this workplace at CSIRO. Is it really a toxic workplace? So the important thing for us is not just what we do, it's not just about the science, but a key thing for us is how we do it. Our chief executive often says to us that it's not what you do that's going to be remembered when you're gone. That's important. What you do day to day matters, but how you do it, how you treat people and how you have an impact, that's going to be your legacy. And so what we're trying to do in this space is make sure that how we treat people, how we treat each other, really leads and sets the example. So, the improvement notice. And I do carry around a copy of the improvement notice with me. It was posted at the particular workplace in Canberra at our Black Mountain laboratories where the investigation by Comcare was undertaken. And look, if anyone ever has some time, Freedom of Information disclosure logs on many websites, CSIRO's and Comcare's, has a lot more detail around the investigation and the improvement notice itself. But what I'll touch on is in the public domain. If you'd like to read about it yourself, you're free to go and have a look on those FOI disclosure logs. An individual, a current officer at the time, did make a complaint to Comcare and did have a workers' comp claim in. There were other things going on in the workplace as well, but Comcare came in and they did an investigation. And Comcare didn't establish that bullying and harassment had occurred. And that's not to dismiss that other things were found. And 2 breaches of work health safety were found. And for your interest, to be aware, I suppose, the first one was that this individual was on a return to work program, and the individual did have other complaints in the workplace against a range of managers, HR staff, HSE staff, health safety environment staff, which I see increasingly happening. The complaints are broadening out to people that are actually involved in the process. But what Comcare found with one of the managers is that a complaint had been made against the manager, and that manager was also responsible for the return to work. And what Comcare said was you should have changed the management. It was a reasonably practicable thing to do. You should have changed that management while there were still allegations in place. So that was one breach. The other breach was in relation to a misconduct process that was on foot with that individual. There were also concerns about that individual in the workplace. And we didn't document a risk assessment going into that misconduct process, and that was the second breach of the Act. Now, in your day-to-day lives, you do risk assessments in your head on a whole range of things. And we did that in that case, but we didn't document it. So one of the learnings, I suppose, is to think more broadly when you are dealing with these types of matters. And that's one of the big learnings for CSIRO. If you can change management, I know it's not ideal, but sometimes you have to make temporary changes. If you do need to document risk assessments, then you need to develop a tool to do that. And CSIRO is happy to assist people or provide copies of ours. So the improvement notice then led to 12 corrective actions, and CSIRO had about 3 months to make changes. And they range from reviewing all of our HR and HSE policies, procedures, putting in place changes around how we deal with complex people cases and governance around that, but in particular introducing risk assessments around psychosocial risk and also health risk assessments. And a new area, an area CSIRO had not dealt with before, particularly in HR and HSE, but we had to come to terms with that pretty quickly and put things in place. We also did pretty wide-ranging training. We made mandatory training for our full workforce on bullying and harassment, but we also did face-to-face training for the particular part of CSIRO where that Comcare improvement notice was issued. So a number of face-to-face sessions all around Australia were done. And we were pleased, and I don't want to again go up in lights and say, great, aren't we? We did manage to have that improvement notice responded to by the due date of 31 December 2012, and then we had Comcare come out and do further inspections, and they did sign off on that in about March 2013. So that was one of the external things I wanted to talk to you about. The next one in the external environment are some of the headlines that we were dealing with in the 2012-13 period. The other thing to also, if you get some time to look up, is a group called the Victims of CSIRO. They've got a website called victimsofcsiro.com. And I'm not standing up here to publicise the work they do because in my view, I'm very proud to work for CSIRO. They do a lot of damage to our organisation. But that group has been an effective group when it comes to social media and when it comes to continuing to have these types of headlines carried in the media. They did a lot of work lobbying the opposition at the time, and the opposition, the shadow Minister for Science, who was Sophia Mirabella at the time. And whenever our executives would go to Senate estimates, most of the time was spent talking about bullying and harassment in CSIRO, not the science or the research that we did. We're getting a lot of media and a lot of allegations that there were hundreds of staff in CSIRO being bullied and harassed on a daily basis. So not a good thing to be dealing with. And I suppose in my area of CSIRO, I see the misconduct cases, I see the grievance cases. That's they do come into our area, and there's nothing like the numbers talked about. But with all this going around, the victims of CSIRO, very effective, a lot of media interest, a lot of political interest in what was happening. Our senior leadership and our board decided they'd open the organisation up to external scrutiny. We do have internal processes for people to use, and there's also external avenues. There's the Fair Work Commission, there's the Human Rights Commission, there's other avenues people can take to bring complaints around bullying and harassment. But our organisation decided that they'd introduce a full investigation. They brought Professor Dennis Pearce into the organisation, and they brought HWL Ebsworth, the law firm, in, and we essentially opened up the organisation, and we allowed former staff and current staff to make submissions to this particular inquiry. And the inquiry was set up last year, February last year, and it did receive, in the first phase, it did receive over 110 individual submissions, and on those 110 submissions there was 130 allegations of bullying and harassment, but also unreasonable behaviour. And so the first phase was to take submissions from individuals, and then if Professor Pearce and HWLE made recommendations to CSIRO that some of those cases should move into phase 2, then they moved into phase 2 and they were investigated. And so from that phase 1 and phase 2, there were 2 reports released, and again, they're all in the public domain. If you have time and you're interested in reading them, they're on the CSIRO.au website, but also the HWLE website. And they make 39 recommendations in total to the organisation. They are around policy and practice, and CSIRO's adopted all of those. And we've largely implemented those. There are still some recommendations from the second phase to deal with, and we're still moving through those. But when it came to the individual submissions of the stories of hundreds and hundreds of cases, what Professor Pearce found was that there were 2 cases that recommendations were made to pursue misconduct. So that doesn't mean that misconduct has been found, but there are 2 cases now subject to a misconduct process internal to CSIRO. And the reason it was done through misconduct is because for CSIRO to take action against our existing officers, we need to do that through our misconduct procedure, not some other external process. So in that process, again, a hard-going time, but we feel from that we have learnt a lot, and we have listened, and we have made good changes. I'll talk to the practical changes in a moment. Just before I do, I did want to just touch on the parliamentary inquiry into workplace bullying. Again, it's just a good resource to have a look at if this topic is something that is coming up in your own workplaces. You may again be aware of this one. Parliamentary inquiry at the Commonwealth level. In 2012 it started. Again, they took over 300 submissions, and again the focus was around the victims or people who had said that they had been bullied or harassed in the workplace. And 23 recommendations made. Largely they've been accepted by the government. One of the key ones you'll probably see from that is the introduction of under the Fair Work Act, of an individual right of remedy when it comes to workplace bullying and harassment. So from 1 January this year, there's now been a jurisdiction in the Fair Work Commission, and I think in the first 7 months they've probably had about just over 400 applications by individuals, and I believe only 1 order at this stage has actually been issued, but more will come through, I'm sure. But when it comes to this particular inquiry, at the same time we did have a number of submissions made in relation to CSIRO. They are obviously redacted, so if you look on this particular website, if you just Google this, you'll see I think there's about 320. There are some of those submissions that relate to our organisation. And I suppose we know because we know the stories, or it sounds a lot like our workplace. But again, a good resource and well worth having a look if this is an area that is starting to impact in your own workplace. But when I get to where CSIRO's headed now, for us, we've heard trust a lot today. It is for us about trying to restore the trust and confidence our staff have in our organisational procedures, and our practices are so important. You can have a process in place, but if you don't apply it, if you don't provide people support through it, then the process really, it can't stand alone. And one of the key learnings for us really is we used to leave bullying and harassment as an individual problem. We used to rely on an individual to come to us and say, I've been bullied and harassed. We used to ask the individual to give us evidence, and we used to ask the individual to put a complaint in. And the learning for us is you can't do that anymore. It's an organisational issue, and the organisation needs to take ownership and responsibility, and the organisation needs to respond. And we've put in place mechanisms for the organisation to take carriage of these matters and not rely on a formal written complaint being lodged. It's a big shift for us. We still think quick and early informal resolution is the key. You've heard this, I think, over the last 3 days. The only way you're going to stop is to either prevent or early intervention, to get in and try and crack these issues as early as possible. Nobody's a winner when it moves into a formal investigation. Everyone's impacted. You yourselves in this room are impacted trying to run and support a process like that. And then probably the last one is proactive monitoring. Once a case is finished, you need to continue to monitor the implementation of the outcomes, and that's where we did let ourselves down as well. So our response when it comes to risk management, so the improvement notice, the victims of CSIRO, the parliamentary inquiry, and then the Pearce review. What we needed to do, and I think the literature supports this, is a risk assessment approach is the way to go when it comes to bullying and harassment. It is about, for CSIRO, building into our HSE risk management plans a mandatory requirement to look at psychosocial risk in the workplace, and that's what we've done since 2013, since the Comcare Improvement Notice. So all risk management plans have to look at psychosocial risk, look at prevention, look at controls. Whenever we have an allegation of bullying and harassment made in our workplace, and that's just an allegation, it doesn't have to be proven, we have to go into that workplace, whether it's a small team, whether it's a group, whether it's a whole line of business, and do a psychosocial risk assessment. It's mandatory, and that's a response to the improvement notice. We also introduced an individual risk assessment, and this is the one that we use. It's mandatory for misconduct. Whenever we commence and at every key stage of misconduct we do a risk assessment, but also for other processes, so performance management, redundancy now, the big organisational restructure, we've done individual risk assessments on all those stuff that we've moved around the organisation. I'll talk about what's in them in a moment. But also we introduced mandatory reporting when it comes to bullying and harassment, again in response to that improvement notice. When you report is a tricky issue, but we have got a template that people need to use to capture, to record a complaint or a report, but when they have to report that in formally, there's some steps that they have to take. So that's the approach we've taken. It is in a risk management approach. So the risk management plans I've touched on, there is that psychosocial hazards identification that we have to do, and mandatory thing. And then we do update them as we go. I think you know about psychosocial risks. I don't think I need to go into those in a lot of detail. When it comes to the psychosocial risk factors that we look at, we wanted to try and couch it in a neutral term. When you look at psychosocial risk assessments, you'll see there's a lot of negative. For me, it almost leads people down a path. So what we wanted to do is just leave it at a high level and allow people to look through. So for us, the risk identification and control assessment process for psychosocial risk factors is about the whole of workplace. It's not just individual, but we know there are individual psychosocial factors that might come into play. So for us, it's about identifying up front in a relevant work area is psychosocial risks such as organisational change, leadership, work systems, culture, relationships, characteristics. We need to look at those and we need to list those. Then we need to assess the impacts of the risks or the behaviours or the practices, and we need to put in place controls to lessen or reduce those. And then we need to control and monitor them. And for us, that's training, that's policies, but it's constant monitoring and updating and new controls if we need to reduce the risk level. So that's one element. When it comes to the individual health risk assessment, again, it's used to identify and assess health risks on an individual who's going to be subject to perhaps a redeployment process, a redundancy process, management underperformance process, but mandatory for misconduct. And so the purpose is to determine the likelihood and the consequence that taking a specific action may cause or exacerbate an injury or an illness. And as I've said, it's required prior to commencing misconduct and it's reviewed at each step. It is advisory in all those other organisational admin processes. Now, who conducts it? A line manager with support from HR, from our area workplace relations and policy, but also HSE. In some cases, a legal person might be involved. Now, you might go, that's a lot of people. And I think the importance for us is a multidiscipline team. It is about collaboration and it is about people who have different areas of expertise potentially commenting or giving us different inputs. And that's a tool that we do also use for complex people cases. We do put a team together that comes from these different areas. Now the line manager input was quite a tricky one for us because our line managers said to us time and time again, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a medical professional, I cannot do a risk assessment on a person's health. And so we've had to do a lot of work one-on-one just-in-time training, a lot of hand-holding up front to help people and line managers in particular to complete the risk assessments and to update them. But I am pleased to say that now that we're 12 months, 18 months in, they are becoming much more comfortable using that particular tool and less worried that they're not a medical professional to complete them. So what do we ask? So these are the questions. We set them up in our standard HSE risk management approach. But very happy if people would like to use these. We're very happy to share them with people if they do contact us. But in essence, what we want to know from a line manager or HR, HSE staff is, do you have direct knowledge that the officer has a pre-existing illness or injury? Are you aware if there's been any previous intervention in relation to this pre-existing illness or injury? Has the officer lodged an incident report, a workers' comp claim? Is there any other organisational processes underway? I mean, one of the learnings for us is we often worked in silos. HR might be running a grievance process or a performance management process, and HSE are running a workers' comp return to work, and they weren't talking, they weren't working together. So we want to capture as much information as we have centrally, and we want people to be working together to manage and support that person and the other people that are involved in the process. List any other specific risks identified, including any workplace-related or interpersonal psychosocial contributing factors. But the ultimate one in doing a health risk assessment, and we have to say this to our managers time and time again, is it's not to stop a process. We're not using it as a barrier. We're using it to inform a process so that we can put in place controls to alleviate the impact or the risks associated with doing a particular organisational process. That's the tool. It's not about preventing or stopping. So the key for us at the end is there any risk to CSIRO, including to another staff member, if the proposed, in this case, misconduct action does not proceed? But similarly, redeployment, performance management. So it's to inform a process, not to stop it. And then we do as I say, we look at the inherent risk, we look at the controls, and then we look at the residual risk and whether or not the action should proceed. And I'd say that there's not been one case where we've stopped a process. We have certainly, in some cases, the risk was high, so we did have medical assessments and other things done, but that just informed the process which then continued. So they haven't stopped a process to date, but potentially they could. So the recording and the reporting when it comes to bullying and harassment issues. Again, for us, we had, the learnings for us is that people report things confidentially, or they'll come and have a chat and they'll say, please don't do anything with this, I just want you to know, but I don't want you to do anything. Or the person complained to me, but they didn't put it in writing. And they didn't call it formal, they called it informal. And so for us, it doesn't matter. If you've received a report of inappropriate behaviour, bullying and harassment, you've got to do something. Under our code of conduct, for example, officers have to report bullying and harassment. And if they don't, then they're potentially in breach. And we didn't want to go down the route of putting all our managers and other staff through code of conduct processes because they hadn't reported. We wanted to introduce something where people at least are aware that they've got an obligation to do something with a report. You can't do nothing. You can't unknow what you know. So we introduced a template. And for us, the template really is, it's a capture. You let the staff member know that you have to capture, and you're not necessarily going to report it in, and you monitor the situation perhaps for a day or 2 days or a week, and if no action's being taken locally to resolve the matter, whether that's self-resolution or assisted resolution, then there is an obligation to report that particular matter in for further action to be taken. Whatever that action is, it really depends on the situation. But there is an opportunity to try and resolve things locally, but for us it's not enough to just let a matter sitting there because the person didn't want you to do something with it. We're now compelling people to do it. So for us, challenges. It's really difficult, as you all know, going through these processes, not only supporting the staff member or the injured employee or the victim of the bullying and harassment, but potentially the managers involved, but also yourselves and your colleagues. And so the learning for us is how do you make sure people are supported, everyone's supported and people are taken care of through these processes. And that's something we're still trying to make sure we do through our processes. The sustained walking the talk. We've had a big increase in awareness and activity, but we want this to be part of business as usual. So we have to continue to monitor people and to make sure things are continuing on. And as new managers come in and new staff in our HR function and our HSE function, we've got to ensure they're aware of our learnings and that they continue to apply those. So the psychosocial risks are really the ones we have to continue to embed and look at. it is pretty challenging for people to think that their lack of consultation or communication, their management style is a psychosocial risk, but it is. And we need people to be aware of it and to put in place controls to manage that. The confidential complaints I've touched on, but we still do have people, particularly who either make or a report, who want to remain confidential, who want to participate in the process but remain confidential. Very tricky for a person to respond to allegations if they're not given particulars, and particulars involve identifying people. So we are still challenged by that in some cases. And then the role of the person to whom the complaint's made, and I've touched on that again, just because a report's made to you in confidence doesn't mean you can just sit on it and do nothing. And it's a constant reminder for us. Now, we have had complaints made where we haven't been able to particularise them, or we haven't been able to actually substantiate the complaint. So what do you do then? And it is another one to navigate and giving feedback to the parties involved and doing that in a way that doesn't breach privacy. But, you know, case by case, we're taking that challenge and we're providing more information to people as we go through those processes. The external review I've touched on, but it is still embedding those changes and making sure that the last few recommendations we have, particularly around the training, continue to happen. And then what we are seeing increasingly, I've touched on it at the beginning, but the impact on all parties when complaints are not substantiated, but also vexatious complaints. You will see some complaints made with malice, but the bar for vexatious and malicious complaint is so high, it's very hard to meet. So we do have managers now where a complaint is not substantiated, where they come back and go, well, clearly it was vexatious, so I want you to take action against the person who made the complaint. And we have counter complaints made as well, which we're trying to navigate. But I also increasingly see HR and HSE staff caught up in processes where allegations are made against them, whether it's because of how they've managed a process or because they're being accused of bullying and harassing people. And not a nice place to be in, but it is, again, another challenging one that we're trying to navigate case by case. So still a lot more for CSIRO to do. I think we have made some positive impact over the last few years, but we want that to revert back to our science and less so our bullying and harassment issues and our HR processes. So happy to take questions if people have any or comments.